So hello, my name's Jo, I'm one of the physiotherapists with the LEEP team. So today your talk is going to be about how your lungs work. So the lungs are fascinating organs and it's made up of a very complex structure, but there's an awful lot that can go wrong with them. A little bit later in the programme of talks, you will have a talk from one of the consultants who will talk about your condition and about what can go wrong. So hopefully this talk will help you understand that a little bit easier. So my aims for today are to help you understand the structure and function of the respiratory system, look at the location and structure of the lungs themselves in more detail, look at why and how we breathe, and then look at the muscles which help us to breathe, which brings us round onto why you're doing this programme and why pulmonary rehabilitation can help you. So the nose is often the most underestimated part of the breathing system. It's the gateway to the respiratory system and it's the only visible part that you will see. It has a very vital function in playing in the quality of air that is delivered into the lungs. It firstly warms and moistens the air entering the lungs so it's the right temperature. And it filters and cleans the air of any pollution or irritants with a tiny series of hairs that line the nose so that when you introduce it into the lungs it's the right temperature and it's nice and clean. So what are the lungs and where are they? So we have two lungs, the right lung and the left lung, and they occupy the space within the chest cavity, as you can see, and they sit either side of your heart. So adult lungs are roughly around 10 to 12 centimetres long and they can weigh around 1 to 1.5 pounds. And if you imagine the position from where your collarbones sit to the cavity between your chest and your abdomen, this is the space that the lungs will occupy. So what coats the lungs? So the lungs have two thin layers of tissue or a double membrane which sit and coat and surround the lung. And in between each layer of these lungs, so you can see the two levels, is a small amount of serous fluid. So it's a little bit like an oil which lubricates. And this stops any friction, one between the lung and the rib cage and between the lung and the cavity itself. So friction within the lungs is a bad thing because it can damage the tissue of the lung itself. So for anybody that's ever had pleurisy, where you get any inflammation of the pleura, it becomes irritated and inflamed and a little bit coarse. You almost want to imagine a balloon with a drop of olive oil in it. You can rub it together quite nicely. If that olive oil wasn't there, you get this generation of friction between the two. So the pleura allow the lungs and the membranes to slide over each other quite nicely when you breathe for when the lungs expand. So let's take a little look inside the lungs. So each lung is separated into lobes. So as you can see on the right side there are 3 lobes and on the left side you have 2 lobes. So your right lung is slightly bigger than the left because as you can see on this picture we have the heart within the same space. So the heart sits slightly to the left so it encompasses or encroaches slightly on that space so there's less room. So the left lung is just ever so slightly smaller. So the mass network of airways, which becomes smaller the further down the lungs that they go, it looks like a giant sponge. So when we strip everything back, as you can see, the picture that you're looking at on your left shows you the airways. So we have the main airways, so this is the windpipe, the trachea, which then splits into your right and your left main bronchi. And these are the main breathing tubes that supply the right and the left lung. The picture on the right shows you the presence of the capillaries, so the blood vessels that supply the lungs themselves. So it's a very fine, intricate network. It looks like a dense sponge when you're looking at it. So the airways start large, and as they split, they become smaller and smaller. Almost a little bit like you're looking at an upside-down tree. So you'd have the main trunk, you'd have then your main branches, and these split further and further as they go down into your airways. So the airways themselves. So the walls of the trachea, or your windpipe, and the bronchi, so your right and your main left bronchi, are protected by C-shaped cartilaginous rings. So these are rigid in structure, they provide support for your windpipe, they keep it in a nice position and they stop your airways from collapsing, as well as protecting the vital airways that sit behind them. The walls of the smaller airways are surrounded by muscles, so they don't have these cartilaginous rings that sit around them. but the muscles that sit around the tubes. So these muscles can become tight and they can become irritated and inflamed. And as you can see on the picture at the bottom, when the muscle becomes tight, the diameter or the lumen of your airways becomes smaller. And this is maybe then when you experience a wheeze or more breathlessness, as you may well do in conditions such as COPD or in asthma. So if we go a little bit further down those airways, so we've gone from your main windpipe, we've gone from your bronchi into your bronchioles, at the very end is these structures which we call the air sacs or alveoli. So there's around 300 million of the alveoli which sit in the airways. And if we were to cross-section them out and lay them out, the surface would cover that of a tennis court. So they're quite extensive, and it needs to be. The bigger the surface area, so the more surface there is, the better the gas exchange, so the more that the oxygen can get into your lungs. They've got very thin walls, almost like a membrane, like a very thin tissue, which allows the air to transfuse across the walls and for the gas exchange to take place. And these are crisscrossed by these very tiny blood vessels called capillaries, which are the smallest ones that we've got in the body. But this allows for the blood supply to circulate around to where the air supply is. So this is our transport system. So this is the nitty-gritty. So this is where the use of our oxygen and expelling of carbon dioxide takes place. So how and why we breathe. So this seems a very, very simple and very logical explanation, but it's useful to go through into a little bit more depth. So the art of breathing is a very delicate balance between the brain, the control centre, which helps control our breathing or our respiration, the muscles and the cells and the nerves, ones which detect changes in the pressure, in the chemical or the balance of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide within the blood, of the muscles which are needing the oxygen and for the energy, and obviously the lungs themselves. So the more that you do and the more active you are, the more energy your muscles will need. So this is picked up with impulses, which is fed back to the brain in the respiratory centre, which tells your lungs that they need to breathe more or bigger or deeper to try and get in more oxygen for more energy. So the brain receives the signals from the body about the amount of oxygen that you need. So when you're sleeping, your body needs very little energy. It needs very little oxygen. So those signals are not firing as frequently, and those lungs don't need to be working as frequently. So the more active you are, the more signals there are to the brain to increase the rate of your breathing. So you need more oxygen going to those muscles when you're active. So how this works. So how do we get the oxygen that we are breathing, so down those series of tubes, into those alveoli? How do we utilise that? So the oxygen enters the bloodstream by the red blood cells. So they're almost a little bit like the tube network or transport network. So it's carried off around the body to the vital organs and the tissues. So to do this, the oxygen has to transfer across the membrane, so across the barrier of the alveoli, into the bloodstream. So this goes into these little capillaries, so these tiny little network of vessels that surround it. So if we were to look at this one, so this is a picture depicting an alveoli or an air sac. So what we have here is we have an arteriole, so this is your blood supply which surrounds this air sac. So you can see how thin the membrane is here. So as air comes into the lungs, it travels down into this blood, into this air sac. The oxygen transfuses, so it goes across this membrane and into the blood supply. And then this goes off into the body to be utilised where it's needed most. At the same time, we produce carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is the waste product of breathing, and this is what we want to breathe out. So this is what happens when the lungs exhale. So at the same time as oxygen is transfusing across into those blood vessels for use around the body, it is also depositing carbon dioxide, so this waste product, which then goes back into the lungs and out the same way as the oxygen came in. So muscles. We need muscles to help us to breathe. And the muscles that help us to breathe are like any other muscles. They need energy to do so. So let's have a little look at the muscles. So the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is the main muscle of respiration. So this is the one that works tirelessly to help us to breathe. It can also be described as a dome-shaped muscle or has a parachute appearance when you're looking at it. So it attaches underneath the rib cage, underneath the lungs. So as this muscle contracts, it flattens and pulls down into your chest cavity, almost encroaching on your abdominal cavity. At the same time, what this does is increases the volume within the lungs in which to take the air in, and therefore more oxygen. As the muscle relaxes, so as the diaphragm comes back up into the thorax or the thoracic cavity, the air is expelled naturally back out of the mouth. In addition to the diaphragm, we also have the intercostal muscles. So we have the internal and the external, and these are finger-like protrusions which sit within the ribs. And these also act to help in elevating the ribs and the thoracic cavity to give it more volume. So almost in a bucket handle effect. So as these muscles contract as well as the diaphragm, this is what is happening within your rib cage, as you can see in this diagram here. And again, it's all in trying to increase the volume of the lungs so you can take in more oxygen. Now there are some other muscles that help you to breathe. Now these are not muscles that we would normally use for breathing. So the main focus of these muscles is around support, it's around posture, and these are things like your scalenii or your sternocleidomastoid. They're also known as the big strap muscles that you can see. And they have a role to play in increasing the volume of the lungs from the top. But these are often muscles that come in for periods of more exertion. So if you were running for a bus or you're doing some sort of activity over and above your normal baseline. So things like your pectorals, so your chest muscles, your abdominal muscles, and also the muscles around the back. So in a quick summary, the respiratory system starts at the nose. It's an incredibly complex system, and there are many parts along the way that can go wrong. Nose breathing is absolutely best. It has a vital role to play, and I would encourage anybody to just take some time to have a think about where your breathing is coming from, whether that the majority of your breathing is coming from your mouth or whether actually it is coming from your nose. They're very complex and fascinating organs, and the muscles which help us to breathe are like any other muscles in the body. They need to be fit and they need to be strong. Respiratory conditions can affect any part of the respiratory system, and as I said at the start, further down the programme of talks you will have a talk from the consultants who look very much in detail at the parts of the respiratory system that is affected by different conditions. And pulmonary rehabilitation has a real role to play in strength, endurance and condition of these muscles in helping you to breathe, identifying where those problems are, identifying where those weaknesses are and helping you to address them. I hope you've enjoyed the talk today. It's very much a whistle-stop tour of the respiratory system, but we would love to hear any questions or any comments that have been raised from today's talk. And as always, you can email us with these at leepinfo@nbt.nhs.uk. Thank you very much.